go ahead.
Hi guys. So today we want to talk to you about how language can be used as an ethnographic window into a society. Specifically, in this case, constructive languages and how writers might use them to bring their reader closer to what they're talking about in their books. And John is a Russian scholar, and I'm an Ivy, so we both liked Nadsat in Anthony Burgess' A Clockwork Orange, published in 1962, and then the movie came out in 1972.
Scholars may be a little bit of a stretch.
You're going to college. You want to do this part?
Yeah, sure. So constructed languages are something that is used through a lot of different parts of fiction. Like 1984 had a made-up language called Newspeak, which was simplified to express the kind of oppression of that government system that was trying to reduce people's ability to express their feelings. Elvish in Lord of the Rings has a lot more whimsical qualities. There's religious books, there's poems, there's plays on words. And Esperanto is a constructed language meant for high intelligibility between speakers of Romance languages. So it's not even part of fiction, it's just something as an experiment in language. And Nadsat is a language from Anthony Burgess' Clockwork Orange, and it's Russian slang mixed into English slang.
One of the key things that we need to remember about constructive language is that in things like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was merely broadening his ethnographic window so that he's creating a richer society in his high fantasy, whereas in 1984 we were trying to actually restrict the culture. In A Clockwork Orange, it works a little bit differently in that all of the words that we encounter actually have double meanings. They can imply other things, but they're never actually used as a comment on that society. It's just a window, which was kind of interesting as opposed to the dystopian novel that is 1984.
Okay, so yeah, going on that same thing. The meaning, there's not a lot of meaning in Nadsat, it's just sort of a teenage register. So when someone speaks using it, you can tell that they are kind of inside that group, which is why it's classified as an argot. It's a group of slang words that a group will have in common, like thieves or teenagers. And the name of it, Nadsat, comes from the Russian root Nadsat. So Adin, Dva, Tri is 1, 2, 3, and Adin Nadsat, Dva Nadsat, Tri Nadsat is 11, 12, 13. So it's even more regular than the English suffix of the same thing. So, time to play a clip.
Let's get things nice and sparkling clear. This sight, if I may call it such, does not become you, my little brothers. As I am your Drugan leader, I'm entitled to know what goes on, eh? Now then, Dim, what does that great big horsey cape of a grin portend?
Alright, no more picking on Dim, brother. That's part of the new way.
New way? What's this about a new way? There's been some very large talk behind my sleeping back at nowhere.
Well, if you must have it then. We go around shop cresting and the like, coming out with a pitiful rooker full of money each. And there's Will the English and the Muscle Man Coffee Mesto saying he can fence anything that any male chick tries to crest. Yeah. The shiny stuff, the ice. The big money's available is what Will the English says.
Big money? And what will you do with the big money? Have you not everything you need? If you need a motor car, you pluck it from the trees. If you need pretty pony, you take it.
Brother, you think and talk sometimes like a little child.
A little child, yeah.
Tonight we pull a man-sized crest.
Tonight's a man-sized crest. Good! Real honor show! Yeah. Initiative comes to those that wait. I've taught you much, my little droogies. Now tell me what you had in mind, Georgie boy.
Oh, the old Moloko Plus first, would you
Moloko
not
Plus,
say?
eh?
He's something to sharpen us up.
Some of the Moloko Plus.
But you especially, we had the start.
Yeah, you got, we got start on you. Yeah, Moloko Plus, eh? Yeah.
Great, right? So it's actually kind of hard to pick a clip from that movie because there's a lot of violence when they're talking in their language. So that was great, though. There was actually teenagers talking to each other, so a little bit more usage. So some of the words you heard there, like a rookerful. Ruka just means hand in Russian, so they took a Russian root word and put an English suffix on it and incorporated it into their vocabulary. And some more there. Horosho is from the Russian word хорошо, which means good, which is completely it's a phonological coincidence that sounds like horror show, but it just fits perfectly into the context of their made-up language. And moloko, they took regular milk, but when they're talking about it, they actually mean milk that's full of drugs. So they've just taken these concepts and given them an opposite meaning from their Russian root.
So, in the 1920s, Russia decided to begin this project in terms of an ethnographic study of all of the different cultures contained in the then brand new Soviet Union. So in 1924, they conducted a really widespread study. Their theory was that they wanted to institute ethno-territorial autonomy for each of the different nationalities. It's funny because in Russia they have two different words for nationalities, narodnost and nationalnost, meaning that they couldn't necessarily tell which one these, nomadic backwater people would identify with. So they had to do the survey a couple of times in the 1920s and then again in the 1930s. But it still meant that they were defining their society in terms of language. So something similar could be said for Great Britain because conservatism was a big policy that started to affect the entire country. They thought poorly of younger ne'er-do-wells, people that committed crimes, and so forth. So Burgess decided to take this burgeoning Cold War situation and talk about it, not necessarily criticizing either for what they were doing, but just meant to discuss the way that language developed in such societies might affect the youth and how the youth might affect that language. And that's why it's cool to talk about language in A Clockwork Orange in terms of its organic properties.
Yeah, so some of the stuff Burgess was trying to accomplish with his language is that it's very musical. It builds off of British rhyming slang, so a lot of the onomatopoeia that they use is more for the musical effect than trying to convey any particular meaning. And the way that it's transliterated, the Russian words just spelled out in English letters, is part of the delivery that makes it seem foreign, but at the same time scary and interesting.
In fact, a lot of the spoken dialogue, in terms of the onomatopoeia at least, is very childish, which is a pretty good indication that, it compounds the idea that this is being told by Alex, who's just a teenager. Another really cool facet about A Clockwork Orange is that in Russian, orange is actually similar to human, to man. Am I correct?
Not that I know of, but...
No. Okay. Well, in any case, a phrase that's repeated over and over again in the book is A Clockwork Orange, but that eventually becomes part of Alex's vernacular, and it's basically implying that, when you're part of the society, you are part of the autonoma. You are part of the people that simply perform function. Cool.
Excellent. So there were 2 Russian translations made of A Clockwork Orange into Russian. So the article about it was called The Homecoming of Nadsat, and Burgess suggested that all the Russian translator would have to do is find English roots with the same meaning and toss them into the Russian text, and it would do exactly the same thing. Both translators read that and were like, what? No, that's impossible. So, however, one translator, Bosniak, put Russian root words, but in Latin script, so you can see it up there. Being able to read a little bit of Russian, that looks really weird, because it's Russian words, but in Latin letters. So Burgess actually wrote the foreword to that edition of the book, or that translation of his book, and he didn't say anything about it. So I kind of imagine he was feeling a little misunderstood because they just ignored his advice. So it was a really interesting cross-language, cross-cultural, just completely unable to communicate the concept they were thinking of. So the Russian translators thought that there was no way English in that place would have the same effect, and of course it can't, because part of the effect that Nadsat has on the original English readers has to do with the English readers' perception of Russia and the Soviet Union at the time. So switching in English would have just confounded the meaning entirely.
So, once again, the work doesn't specifically castigate a society, but Nadsat works in a way to draw the reader out of their normal comfort zone, to talk about horrifically violent things simply at face value. True, they're ridiculous and wouldn't necessarily happen in the same way in real life, but Nadsat is a way to talk about this kind of violence in terms of growing up in the mind of an immature teenager. So, Alex kind of works as an iconoclast in this respect because he becomes the symbol for misunderstood but still growing youth that you don't really know how to feel about because he's a terrible person, but he's also still a kid.
So yeah, that's it. Questions?
In Russian, how would you ask it?
What?
Do you have any questions?
У вас есть вопросы?
Do you have any?
Нет? Спасибо.
You can tell us why you chose this language.
Well,
Because you were so impressed by the historical, political background of it?
we wanted to be really ambitious and cover a lot of different constructive languages and give a bunch of different examples of how it works in terms of ethnography and describes the culture. And we wanted to cover Dothraki in George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. But that was a lot, so we decided to limit it to just Nadsat. There's a lot to talk about, so.
Yeah, we at one point had like 8 or 9 different constructive languages on the table, but it was just too broad. And I tried to narrow it down to maybe Newspeak in 1984, with both have a lot of influence from Russian, but even that was just way too much to fit in 10 minutes, which I think we still went over.
It's okay.
The
So-
author was a linguist too, so this is one way how linguists could be transferred into your professionalism. So while writing a book, he uses linguistic background just to incorporate this language and show its linguistic impact. Thank you so much. So you have the resources if you guys are interested. You can go check them out. Thank you.